Welcome back everybody to Silver Knight PCs. It's been a little while since our last video, but we're going to work on making more content regularly into the future and bring you more exciting videos. Feel free to drop us a like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Today we're looking over the RTX 4090 Suprim Liquid X. This card is the smallest card in the RTX 4090 lineup from MSI, and we are going to do a teardown of the card today. We're doing some before and after thermal testing to see if we can improve the memory and GPU temperatures by using aftermarket thermal paste and pads. The Suprim X Liquid has a fantastic GPU die temperature, but the GDDR6 memory can get a little warm. We found the GPU temps would max out around 63C, and the memory would regularly hit over 86C. Let's head over to the tech room and take a look. Welcome to the tech room. We've been working on this 4090 the better part of the day. It is really late at night and we're still working on it. Unfortunately, we ran into some issues with power delivery on the card. The included PCIe 5.0 power cable on the 1000 watt power supply from MSI is more than adequate to run the card, but with this super high-end motherboard and the water cooling BIOS that's on it, the combination of the 7950X and the 4090 trigger overcurrent beeps that just screech the whole time. So if you're going to be running this specific configuration with a Ryzen 9, at least the 16 core and most likely the 13900K on a Z790 with a higher end platform, this is a 22 phase VRM. We recommend running like a 1200 or 1300 watt power supply just because of the extra power that's needed to be able to run everything. We are using the gaming BIOS, and one of the issues with the Suprim in general is because of the fantastic temperatures on the GPU core, you do have problems with just all the other componentry on the motherboard, or sorry, the circuit board getting cooled properly. The memory, the VRMs, and other small componentry isn't going to get as adequately cooled as a full facing block with a big heatsink cooling all of it. So one of our goals is going to be swapping out the thermal pads on the card to be able to improve temperature performance. And even at 100% fan speed, we had cranked it all the way up in MSI Afterburner. Just running superposition on a single pass, we're hitting 86C on the memory. And that's ideally as fast as you can get the fan inside of the heatsink to cool. So what we're going to end up having to do is replace all the thermal pads inside the card, and then you can use the included power adapter cable, which is right here. The MSI one, unlike the NVIDIA Founders one, has a sensing pin for all 4 pins, and it also has a single pin to each connector on these PCIe 8-pin connectors. The one that's included with the power supply is a straight through cable, so it's pin to pin on the power supply. So on the included power adapter with the 4090, there's sensing pins for each one of the 4, versus on the Founders Edition connector, there's only, I don't know if I can get it clear here, but the Founders Edition sensing pins are only 2. Additionally, the quality of the cable is much higher. That being said, if you have the option to run one of the PCIe Gen 5 power supplies, that is the better option to go with, because you have 1 pin to 1 pin on the power supply. There's also less material. There's a lot of material in this connector that you have to kind of contend with, and that it creates bulk and mass. And when you're trying to, work with this inside of a computer case, you might have glass in the way, whatever it is, that can cause additional pressures in this area. And from as far as what we can tell, looking at a lot of the melting power cables and issues that a lot of people are having with them, is that it seems to be a combination of a lot of bending right next to the connector and then left and right bending. If you're bending closer to the adapter pins here, this isn't going to cause any problems. All right, let's talk about disassembly. Alrighty, we start the disassembly of the 4090 Suprim. Not the Supreme, the Suprim. Now, generally there's not a whole lot of rules of thumb for disassembling video cards. A lot of people have rhymes and rhythms. I find it easier to start with the screws you can see and then work on the ones you can't see. Now, I'd be taking bets, but I have a feeling that this card has less screws in it than an NVIDIA 20 Series Founder Edition. But I feel like that bet would be too easy because that card has a ridiculous number of screws. I think it's like 50 or 60 plus. All right. Boom. Now, first thing we're doing here is taking off the back plate. Hopefully, this is not too hard. And knowing MSI's previous cards, they usually use the same size screws in all the same positions. So as long as they keep them grouped up, there shouldn't be any like super long ones or anything like that. All right, here comes the back plate. Booyah. It's actually a decent amount of thermal pads. Got all the power delivery here and here on either side of the card. Some here, those are pretty thick. These don't do much because they're just sucking a little bit of heat off of these. So we're going to set that to the side here. Okay. Next, we got to go ahead and remove the 4 screws that are holding the cooler on. But I don't know if that's the right answer. On this water-cooled cards, there's screws all along the edges here, so I think we'll give that a shot first. Oh, you know what? There's things holding on that shroud, so let's do that first. Oh yeah. Alright, there's a lot of fucking cables in here. So this one, oh my god, talk about a nightmare. Alright, so this one will be unplugged here. Alright, so there's a cable underneath, I don't know how visible it is, but there's a cable here underneath the CPU fan connector. I'm sorry, not CPU fan connector, the GPU water hoses. There's a fan header. And then there's another one on the corner here, which probably connects up to some of the RGB lighting. Out of the two, this one is way more accessible when you get the shroud off. So if you're doing this mod, definitely take this one off first, rotate it around. Way easier to get to. And it's routed underneath the hose, so I really don't know how removable that is. Let's see if we can get it off without damaging it. There we go. Off. All right, shroud is removed. Okay. All right, next up we are looking at this freaking chonker of a cooling system. So what's interesting is on this card, the water cooler is, at least the base plate is touching the memory. So there really isn't a reason why the memory should be getting that hot. The only reason I could think of is if the cold plate isn't actually extending that far, because that'd be a huge cold plate. Like, it's probably only the size of the pump. So we're probably in a spot where this is just copper that's touching copper, and the thermal conductivity of these thermal pads might not be that great. They're pretty thin too. We might actually just replace them with thermal paste, because that might be a better solution. All right. Look at that. Looks beautiful. Okay, let me grab the calipers real quick. Alright, so let's do some analysis. The thermal paste quality is pretty dry. Like, I'm pushing it with my finger and it's barely moving it. Yeah, that's really dry thermal paste, which is odd to me because this card couldn't have been produced more than, well, maybe it was produced longer than that, because this looks like thermal paste that has already been dry for a couple of weeks at least. I don't know. Let's see if we can soften it up. We're just using some 99% isopropyl alcohol. Let's see here. Man, that is chalky. This reminds me of Intel TIM. Thermal interface material on the old CPUs back when they still thermal pasted them before they switched over to soldering most of their CPUs. Alright, so we got the base plate nice and clean. Okay, and then we're going to do the same on here. Okay. I'm just going to wipe that clean. These are just blue shop towels like they sell online. But they don't leave little residues of paper towel, which is amazing. And we're going to be replacing this with MX6 thermal paste. Wherever I set that tube down. Huh. Can you hand me a tube of MX6? Hold up. Oh, it's right here. So we're going to be using some MX6 thermal paste here. This is the newest stuff from Arctic. Is the MX6 thermal paste. Let me see if I can get it to focus. Focus on me, buddy. There you go. Yep. So we just got this in from Arctic. It's some pretty good stuff. We loved MX5. I have a feeling that MX5 is going to be a weird thermal paste in the future because there's no more of it being made, and it's actually got some interesting properties under liquid nitrogen. But yeah, that's what we're going to be using for that. And then we're going to be using some thermal pads from Thermalright. These are 14.8 meter per watt Kelvin thermal pads. So there's that to consider. Alright, let's see. I'm going to take the back plate off here. I'm sorry, not the back plate, this back screw that I think is holding on that big plate. And it looks like there's two screws here. Let me take those out real quick. Oh, those are tight. Really tight. Holy crap. Those are thick screws. I have a feeling a lot of GPU manufacturers have now switched over to using more support in the design of their cards, like here and here, which is actually a fairly good design to keep the card rigid from sagging as much. And I mean, there's just nothing but surface area all throughout this card. Mid block, I don't even know what you'd call it, mid cooler. We do have a couple screws that are screwed directly into the PCIe slot bracket. Let's go ahead and unscrew those. And that should allow this whole plate to come off. Oh, there we go. Boom. All right, so now we got to get this plate off. See if I can get it to release without bending the PCB too bad. Come on. Oh, I hate that noise. It's creaking of a circuit board. It is tight on there. If we can separate it maybe up in this corner. There we go, come on. There we go. Aha. Alright, so it looks like it's using thermal pads all throughout the cooler design. I don't see any thermal putty, which is interesting. Because these could be thermal putty instead. But they use thermal paste almost throughout the whole design exclusively. Let's just look at this real quick and measure with the calipers. We got let's see here. Oh, looks like a 1 millimeter. 1 millimeter. So they're using 1 millimeter throughout the whole card. Okay. We're gonna have to compress our 1.5 millimeter pads a little bit. Not the end of the world. As long as we're not putting it too close around the die, we should be fine. Oh man, this stuff is dry. How long was this in here? Is there any manufacture dates anywhere on the PCB? Can't tell. If somebody spots one, feel free to say so in the comments. Alright, so we got those corners. All that's actively cooled. Jeez. Jeez Louise. Alright, that's off. That's off. See if I can get this stuff off real quick. It's just so dry. I know a lot of these GPU manufacturers like to use these like chalkier thermal pads, but they just fall apart when you try to do any kind of maintenance on the card, so they're almost necessitated to be replaced because they get stretched super easy, they don't really hold their form, and these 1 mil pads are just really thin. Alright, so now that we've gotten the PCB basically fully exposed, we can kind of do a little bit of an analysis and look at it better. So there's some interesting stuff to note. There's an extra connector or fan header. I don't know what this would be, but I'm assuming based on this being J10, this being J8, that these are two different fan connectors, and this is missing. It might be also that this is the fan connector and this is the RGB header. So there is possibly a scenario where in the future they have that, but it's missing. It's got pads though. And then on the back side, there's nothing particularly outlandish or crazy. Everything looks pretty standard for a card of this size. I will say the PCB is very efficient. There's no wasted space really, with the exception of maybe like right here and right here, but there's really no other way you could design this circuit board. What is interesting to note is everything is getting cooled. I mean, every single part of this card is getting cooling. Even these little components here on the PCB are getting cooling with thermal pads to at least the heatsink that's sitting on top of it. And then what's also interesting is these power phases. I mean, this is a really well built power delivery. I mean, it's freaking chonky, and these are all high-end parts. This isn't like the reference design. MSI really overbuilt this card, which is amazing because that means that when people decide to start doing liquid nitrogen stuff on it, it might actually be a very interesting scenario. What's cool is most of the thermal pads, as far as I can tell, I'm going to double check and measure them during the reassembly, are all 1 millimeter. So you can safely say that all these are 1. On the back side of this back plate, it looks like these here are probably 1.5 mil, just by glancing at them. Let's just do a quick measurement and verify. We're going to use the calipers again. These might be 2s, depending on how my calipers decide to. No, it's 1.5 mil. Yep, those are 1.5 mil. And then these thick, pasty boys, let's see, these are probably closer to 3 mil. Yep, these are 3 millimeter. So these are 3 millimeters, 3 millimeters, 3 millimeters, 1.5, and these are also 1.5. Yep. So all the pads in here are 1 millimeter and 1.5 on the outside. I'm going to be using 1.5 millimeter all throughout here because there's really no reason I can't. They'll compress. It's the one nice thing about thermal pads is that they have a little bit of give. The one area that I'm concerned about is the memory, and we'll see how it plays out. If the thermal pads are too thick with these big copper protrusions on the side to help cool them, then we might run into a situation where it creates too much space between the GPU die and the cooler, and then the temperatures won't be that good on the GPU. But we'll figure that out once we do the test. And if during the test it's overheating, then we know that I need to swap them for 1 mil pads. But yeah, it looks pretty good. The water block here has got no active cooling on any of the memory, which explains why the memory temperatures are not that great. There's no way. I almost rather have this plate cool the memory than the water block here, because this plate is getting actively cooled by the fan blowing across it. But what is probably happening, and the reason they probably went this route, is this is probably not enough to cool the GDDR6X, and so as a result they had to include it as part of the water block. But as you can see, you can probably see the lines barely ever so slightly in the milling here. I think this part of the memory is getting cooled by water ever so slightly, probably the edges here and the edges here. But these two off to the sides are definitely not. I mean, you can tell by the screw hole pattern and everything, there's really no way for water to get anywhere near them. And there's also a possibility these aren't either. So the only thing really cooling them is the copper just transferring the heat to this area through just heat soaking, and then what little bit of air hits from the fan blowing across them. The thermal pads might increase performance. They may not. We're going to see what happens. But there's only one way to find out. After our thermal paste and thermal pad modifications, the max observed temperatures on the GPU die was 60 C, and the memory maxed out at 76 C at full power limit and same clock speeds. We used the Thermalright Extreme Odyssey thermal pads with a thermal conductivity rating of 12.8 meters per watt Kelvin. Overall, the observed improvement is well worth the work involved.